Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are unpacking a truly fascinating, honestly, kind of intense piece of source material. So, the document is titled To the Ones Left Behind, and it basically functions as a highly specific eschatological survival guide. Now, as we go through this today, our goal isn't to debate or endorse the theology as objective reality. Instead, we're going to impartially analyze this text as a profound psychological and tactical blueprint, written for a very specific apocalyptic scenario. We're going to map out the structure of the author's argument, from the initial shock of a global event right down to the gritty, everyday details of off-grid survival. It's an absolutely compelling look at how this particular worldview prepares for the ultimate crisis.
Right off the bat, the author really doesn't ease the reader in. I mean, the text opens with this incredibly powerful directive. Imagine finding this document right after a catastrophic, world-altering event. The author is speaking directly across time to a reader who is presumably in a state of absolute shock. By acknowledging the grief and the crying right up front, the document creates this high-stakes psychological intimacy. It's essentially telling the reader, I know you're devastated, but you have a job to do. Your physical reality might be crumbling around you, but your spiritual survival, that is the immediate priority.
Section 1. The Sudden Global Trauma. To really grasp the gravity of the instructions that follow, we have to establish the chronological starting point of the text. The entire document hinges on the immediate, totally chaotic aftermath of an event where millions of people have suddenly disappeared. The source text describes this as a literal nightmare trauma, and it explicitly addresses one of the most horrifying psychological aspects of this whole scenario: the disappearance of children. The author's advice here is just chillingly pragmatic. They tell parents, don't look for them. Just take a second to let the cinematic gravity of that claim settle. In the midst of unimaginable panic, the directive is to make peace with a reality that is stranger than fiction. The author is urging the reader to bypass that natural, hardwired human instinct to search and mourn. Instead, they need to rapidly accept the supernatural explanation, because time is completely of the essence.
Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds. Failure of the modern church.
The author then pivots from that immediate trauma to a really deep sociological critique, like why were so many people caught off guard? Why is the reader, presumably someone who had access to this information beforehand, now left behind? The author actually starts this critique by looking in the mirror, which makes the text quite compelling, honestly. They confess to experiencing what they call moral cowardice prior to the disappearance. The author admits to fearing confrontation, disliking being called a false prophet or a troublemaker, and fearing the loss of reputation and friends. They wanted peace with people more than they wanted to have uncomfortable conversations about the impending apocalypse. This vulnerability sets the perfect stage for a much broader critique of the modern religious establishment.
And this brilliantly illustrates the author's core thesis regarding the broader spiritual community. The text argues that the modern church basically prioritized comfort and applause over actual spiritual readiness. Drawing directly from the biblical book of Revelation, the author outlines 5 severe rebukes given to historical churches, mapping them directly onto the modern era: becoming lukewarm, abandoning their first love, compromising with false teaching. The author asserts that a church that fails to prepare people for the specific end-time scenario has essentially forgotten one of its greatest hopes. It chose to blend in with the present world rather than stand apart from it.
This brings us to a fascinating comparison made in the source material. The author contrasts the test faced by those who warned of the event beforehand, they call them the watchmen, with the test that will be faced by the reader, the ones left behind. Before the disappearance, the watchmen faced skepticism, right? They were mocked, laughed at, lost their credibility when anticipated timelines didn't pan out. But the text warns that those reading the document in the aftermath will face a brutally different reality: the Great Tribulation. Their enemy won't be skeptical friends anymore, but a world system that utilizes intense global pressure, total economic control, and even torture and death to enforce compliance.
Section 3. Tactical off-grid survival.
This is where the document shifts gears in a really major way. It transitions from a theological warning into a very practical, gritty survival guide for those facing this extreme global pressure. The author lays out specific, tactical requirements for surviving the collapse of ordinary resources and the rise of strict government control. First, avoid digital systems. If communications are controlled, digital information can be confiscated or tracked. The author urges the reader to preserve physical copies of the Bible and, crucially, to memorize it. Next, if you're in a large city and can't get basic necessities without compromising your beliefs, the advice is to flee to safer places. And finally, the text heavily emphasizes acquiring hard survival skills:
finding clean water, growing food, preserving harvests, and learning basic trauma first aid. The spiritual war in this text demands immense physical resilience.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the behavioral nuance the author advises. In a time of extreme persecution, you might expect a call to absolute martyrdom at every single turn. But the source text makes a critical distinction between faithful witness and needless provocation. The author explicitly tells the reader, live wisely, avoid unnecessary attention, do not seek conflict. The goal is to speak the truth with courage, absolutely, but not to invite danger through recklessness. It's a highly strategic approach to navigating a very hostile world.
Furthermore, the author outlines a clear sociological survival strategy. Basically, you cannot do this alone. The text stresses that cooperative, compassionate communities endure far better than isolated individuals. The instructions are specific. Share your food, pray together, and actively protect the most vulnerable among you, the weak, the widows, the elderly, and the sick. The author notes that isolation breaks courage. In this survival scenario, maintaining your humanity and your community is just as vital as finding that clean water.
Section 4. Refusing the beast's mark.
All of this survival preparation leads up to the climactic spiritual standoff of the document. This is where tactical off-grid survival meets the ultimate test of spiritual allegiance. To prepare the reader for this standoff, the text maps out historical precedents. The author wants the reader to understand that suffering is not a sign of defeat, it is the historical legacy of their faith. Think Joseph suffering in Egypt, Daniel surviving exile in Babylon, Jeremiah being ignored, the early Christian apostles being imprisoned and executed. The author uses these historical data points to argue that true faith has never been built upon comfort. It has always been built upon enduring persecution with an eye toward ultimate resurrection.
So, the crucial point is this absolute non-negotiable directive. The author issues a massive high-stakes warning. Do not take the mark of the beast. The text is very clear about the cost of this refusal. The author states plainly that the reader may lose their home, their possessions, their career, their friends, their freedom, and even their life. But the instruction remains absolute, no matter what. If governments demand worship, refuse. If lies become law, hold to the truth. In the logic of this document, the greatest victory isn't merely surviving the apocalypse. The greatest victory is remaining completely faithful, even at the cost of your physical life.
Section 5. Ultimate Victory of the Lamb.
But the document doesn't end in the darkest hour of the tribulation. Let's look at how the author guides the reader out of this intense suffering and into the concluding resolution of the text. Despite detailing torture, loss, and death, the author gives a strict mandate for maintaining spiritual purity that is quite remarkable. The persecuted reader is instructed to refuse bitterness, refuse revenge, and refuse despair. Most strikingly, they are commanded to pray for the very people who are actively hunting them, with the hope that the persecutor today might become a believer tomorrow. It's an incredible psychological pivot, demanding radical forgiveness in the face of absolute tyranny.
And that leads to the source document's ultimate conclusion. Despite the apocalyptic trauma, the nightmare of missing children, the total collapse of society, and the very real threat of execution, the text ends on a note of absolute triumph. The Lamb wins! The author assures the reader that the kingdoms of this world, no matter how oppressive they seem, are temporary. By standing firm and humbly refusing the mark, the reader is promised an eternal inheritance that completely supersedes any physical death.
Which brings us to a final thought for today's explainer. We've just navigated a deeply intense apocalyptic survival guide. But stepping back from the specific theology for a second, it poses a really fascinating, broader question for all of us. If an unprecedented global crisis shattered society tomorrow, literally stripping away digital systems, supply chains, and all our social norms, would your current worldview provide the mental, tactical, and moral resilience to survive? Or would the collapse demand a complete, ground-up reevaluation of your life and values? It's a heavy question, for sure, but one this fascinating source document forces us to consider. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep seeking clarity out there.